By now, the TrimUI Brick is not a new device. We all should know exactly how good this single device is, and personally, I think it deserves more love than it already gets, especially with this all new metal body update. It's something definitely worth talking about, and honestly, I think it's a corner of the market that is really underutilized by the manufacturers. It tends to be one of my favorite form factors, and it's one that I think everyone should own. G'day guys, if you've never seen me here before, I'm Dre from Gojeda Tech, and I'm a retro handheld enthusiast. I make videos on all things retro handhelds, gaming, and well, tech. Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at this here TrimUI Brick hammer, the newish metal chassis refresh of the TrimUI Brick, my previous favorite handheld. Now, you might be saying to yourself, didn't this thing come out ages ago and other reviewers get their videos out months ago? And well, if you're saying that, you would be right. But there is a good but frustrating reason for this, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But with that being said, let's get into talking about this little thing here. On the inside, it had stayed mostly the same as the original Brick. We have the all-winner A133P SoC, a whole 1 GB of RAM. There's 8 gigs of internal storage that houses the stock firmware, as well as a micro SD card slot for expansion. Thankfully, we kept the same beautiful 3.2-inch display at a luxurious 1024 by 768 resolution, wireless internet and Bluetooth connectivity, 2 front-facing speakers and a 3.5mm jack to connect those ancient wired earphones that some people have. We've also got a built-in microphone for those weird DS games that make you yell in public. And all of this is powered by a more than adequate 3000 mAh battery, which is charged up by that USB port on the bottom. Now, when it comes to pricing, like any of these retro handhelds, it can be pretty volatile and can vary quite a bit depending on retailer. On AliExpress from my recommended seller, AM Pone, it'll run you about 82 USD. On PowerKitty, it'll be about 85 USD plus shipping. Keep Retro will be about the same at 90 USD plus shipping yet again. Now, keep in mind, all of these prices I mentioned don't include an SD card and are only accurate at the time of writing this. So as always, do some shopping around and find the best price whenever you're looking. Now, another place I tried is TrimUI Store, which appeared at about the same time as the launch of the pre-order of the Brick Hammer. At first, it seemed like it was the official shop for TrimUI, but that still seems to be a mystery as to who's running this, and it kind of seems like they're just another dropshipper. At this point in time, though, I'm just going to say be wary as ordering from them and go along with one of the other trusted ones until they build up more of a reputation and we can trust them a little bit more. I'm going to get into the reason why I'm saying that in just a little bit, but before that, let's actually unbox one of these things and see what we get. Now, for a quick fake unboxing like most of these things are, the box itself is the same as the original Brick, only this time they just slapped on some stickers that let you know that this is indeed a hammer, like this one here on the side, and the one on the bottom that also tells you which color is in the box. On the inside, you have the Brick hammer itself protected by some foam. Under that is some paper with some words on it and a USB-C cable. And then finally, underneath that is 2 extra sets of back button caps. Now, I think the proper place to begin reviews is, well, at the start of the story, which for me, realistically, is the buying experience. Since I bought this myself out of pocket, since I genuinely just wanted an upgraded version of the Brick. Before I get too into it though, this is a bit of a long story, and if it's not something that's important to you, I have timestamps down below if you want to skip ahead. So, to start at the very beginning, I paid for and pre-ordered this specifically green Brick hammer back on June 19th on a website called TrimUI Store. At that point in time, and I think still now, it wasn't really known who ran that website. And in fact, it actually had the lowest price compared to other sites. So me being perhaps naive, assuming it was an official TrimUI storefront, that's where I decided to order it from. Time went along and other reviewers got their units direct from TrimUI, and I started to get pretty excited. Then after a while, after seeing posts on Reddit of people receiving their units, meanwhile my order, which was pretty early on in the pre-ordered cycle, showed absolutely no movement. So I decided to email TrimUI Store to see what the go was, and I got this reply, which basically says there was some manufacturing issues that was affecting the delivery and fulfillment of some orders, and they kindly offered me a free accessory for the inconvenience. Now, this exchange happened on July 27th, so that's already a month after the initial pre-order. So I left it for a few weeks, but eventually reached out again in August, so more than a few weeks, where I got a response that they were working on shipping orders and that they would all be sent by the end of August. That ended up being a lie. So I followed up again the following week as there were more and more posts on Reddit of people getting their hammer units with order numbers significantly higher than mine, where this time they promised that they would prioritize my order with the next batch that arrived every couple of days. That again, unfortunately, was a lie. and I made the decision to cancel my order with TrimUI Store. Being burned by them, I decided to go to my old trusty AliExpress and placed an order from an in-stock green hammer from AM Pwn. It showed as there was 5 left when I placed my order, which apparently it wasn't. And in that conversation, they offered me if I wanted the gray one, if I wanted them to ship one to me straight away. I didn't want the gray, I wanted the green, so I waited a few days for that to automatically cancel and be refunded. Then finally, I went to PowerKitty, which is where I ordered my original brick from. Messaged them if they had any in stock, they didn't, and roughly when they would have one, which was somewhere in late September. And I placed my final order on the 16th of September and decided to try and be patient. That order finally arrived on my doorstep on the 9th of October, a full 112 days from when I placed my original pre-order. I did the maths. That's 30.7% of the year, almost a full 1/3 of a calendar year. To say that the buying experience of this device was awful would be an understatement. The launch and pure lack of communication from TrimUI was and still is a disappointment. To this day, I still have no idea where to even begin to look for any kind of communication from them. To say that this left a bitter taste in my mouth would be the least, and I mentioned this as a warning more than anything, and I tried to not let it affect the review since it really has nothing to do with the device itself, but it makes the issues that have arisen more annoying, which I will get into in a moment. And on a side note of how I expect pre-orders to go, I pre-ordered the AYN Thor on the 26th of August, and that one is already shipped and on its way to me at the time of writing this script, which today is currently October 16th. With that out of the way, let's actually get our hands on the hammer and talk about how it feels to hold and use. The first thing you'll notice when you have it in your hands is that it's significantly heftier than the original brick, which isn't exactly surprising, but let's give them a quick way to get the actual numbers. The hammer weighs in at 202 grams, meanwhile the original weighs pretty much 162 grams. A not insignificant 40-gram difference, which again, isn't really a surprise, but I will say that it isn't too heavy by any means, and it doesn't affect the use in any kind of way. After that, it's very obviously cool to the touch due to the all aluminium construction, and it actually feels pretty satisfying to hold. The face buttons and D-pad feel almost exactly the same as its plastic counterpart. The face buttons still have that same soft click feel that I, for one, love on this kind of form factor. Now, the D-pad on the other hand might be a point of contention for some, since it has a similar soft micro switch that reminds me of the Retroid style D-pads, which happens to be my favorite in any handheld so far. Now, testing the D-pad is always a little interesting, so I'll go with the industry standard tests of Contra to see how easy it is to have misinputs and accidental diagonals, and Street Fighter to see how easy it is to get those intended diagonals when you do want them. If you're watching this video, you have no doubt seen Retro Gamecore and how he conducts this test. To him, a pass will consist of a little bit of character movement side to side at the farmost edges of holding down the D-pad, where a fail would be excessive movement or no movement, which turns out to be a pretty subjective form of test, so take these results with a grain of salt. As you can see here, when I hold down the D-pad and give it a light wiggle, the character is pretty much completely stationary. I can, however, get him to move side to side, albeit with a lot of force, enough of which that my thumb actually starts to hurt. This is by no means quantitative, but I reckon you'd be hard stuck getting accidental diagonals on this D-pad. With that being said though, I had no issues performing Hadoukens and Shoryukens in Street Fighter after getting used to the inputs and the size of this D-pad itself, which is actually quite small. Also here playing a Portmaster game, which in this case is Celeste Classic, a precision platformer style game, I had no issues actually getting the D-pad to input diagonals when I wanted it to. I also didn't get any accidental diagonals when I didn't want them. As with any of these subjective tests though, take this with a grain of salt. So with that said, and my very scientific testing, this is a good D-pad. It's super easy to use, I didn't have to fight with it to get the inputs I wanted, and overall it has a really good feel to it. Though it is on a little bit of the smaller side, measuring in at 18.5 millimeters, which for comparison's sake is 1 millimeter smaller than the Retroid Classics D-pad that measures in at 19.5 mil. The Miyu Mini comes in at 20.7, and finally the RG35XX Plus comes in at 21.7 millimeters. So out of all these devices, it is pretty plainly the smallest, and I'm not sure that I would recommend this D-pad or this device really for any super intense fighting games such as Street Fighter or intense platformers like the full fat Celeste, since the small size can be a little bit fatiguing. But for those more casual scenarios, it is perfectly adequate. And to be honest, that's where this device really shines. Really quickly here though, since I had those other devices out, I sat them all out together to do a kind of size comparison. With them all laid out like this, it's easy to see it's not the smallest of the bunch. That crown happily belongs to the MIUI Mini with this set of handhelds. In my opinion, it lives in this sort of Goldilocks zone between the MIUI Mini and the RG35XX Plus. The MIUI was honestly a little too small for me to be comfortable gaming for any sort of extended period, and the RG35XX Plus was just too big to be pocketable and daily carried. I've also got on the table the Retroid Classic, which is my current favorite vertical handheld in general, on the size and comfort of the Brick, and this Brick Hammer. Like I said, it hits this Goldilocks zone of being large enough to be semi-comfortable to play on for extended periods, while also being genuinely pocketable. Now, that should be prefaced by saying I have pretty average sized hands. I wear a size medium glove, so your mileage may vary. Even though it is larger than the MIUI Mini, which was my favorite handheld for single-handed gaming, I can still hold the Brick Hammer and use it one-handed for games like Pokemon and such, which turns out to be pretty important for me when I'm out and about and my other hand is occupied by carrying my son or drinking a coffee. Now, going back to the front of the Brick Hammer, the menu, start and select buttons are all clicky micro switches, as well as the two RGB function buttons. We have the same speaker holes too. Interestingly, with this device though, I can see a metallic shiny speaker behind that grill, which I don't see on the original, which makes me think that there is a new or different set of speakers in here. So I'll have to do a teardown to confirm or deny that assumption. On the right side of the device, we have a switch that will do many different things depending on what firmware you decide to load on here, and the clicky RGB power button. The left side's pretty plain, boarding just some clicky volume up and down buttons. On the bottom, we have a pretty simple setup. We've got our main USB port to use for charging, 3.5mm jack, a reset switch, and finally our micro SD card expansion slot. Moving around to the back of the device, we have my first and biggest complaint. Out of the box, these back buttons are a complete mess. Having a look at them, it's pretty easy to see that the left side sits higher than the right for some reason. And before you mention it, yes, the caps themselves are all the way seated, and that's not the reason they're like this. Aside from that, the left bumper and the right have a completely different feel. It's not obvious on camera, but the sound difference will be noticeable. The left one is clickier in both the sound and feel, almost as if they used a different kind of switch on the inside, like they ran out of the normal kind and slapped a random on it, which I'm gonna have to check when I do the teardown, or if it's just a different batch. And while I'm in there, I'm gonna see if I can fix the misalignment of the back buttons. The rest of the back is impeccable. The design is still gorgeous. There's a new nice touch of this gloss patch on the hammer, which looks really classy to me. The texture is comfy, the engraved TrimUI logo is fantastic and a touch of class, as well as the inclusion of the extra USB port to connect either USBs, or in the case that I use it, my USB-C to 3.5mm dongle for listening to music. Now, to see about these misaligned buttons. All right, so let's crack these guys open and see what we can find. On both devices here, it's pretty obvious we have the same 6 screws around the perimeter holding the two halves together. So let's get those out first and go from there. Now, I will mention, if you're gonna do this yourself, make sure you have I've got this handy little magnet mat here so that I can keep the screws organized as I take them out. You never know when you're doing this sort of stuff if a screw is gonna be a slightly different size, so keeping them organized is gonna be one of the best things you can do for yourself. But now all 6 screws are out, so we can disassemble the halves from each other. All right, pulling this one apart, you can see that the battery is just connected there. So very carefully just disconnect that. Cool. Now with the battery disconnected, it's pretty safe to have a little play around with this. But I'm gonna leave this to one side and then pull this side apart. All right, a quick look at the inside of both of these devices. Nothing looks too different between the two. I mean, you can see here that they're both TrimUI Brick v1.0 boards. Underneath this here is the main Allwinner A133P chip. There's the same here, I've just got the thermal pad on top of that. Other than that, everything here looks pretty similar. I have noticed down here though, I'll move these up, the speaker wire on both of these is actually different, so that makes me think that the speakers are in fact different. Oh, actually, and the rumble motor, the different wires. But other than that, they look pretty similar so far. See, up here we have the antenna module, On the metal one, it's slightly different, seeing as well it's a metal case, so you want it closer to the outside so it's not interfering. Might have to disconnect that so I can flip this over and have a look at those speakers. This here will be the display as well. The display ribbon cable. Got to be very careful with those when we disassemble that. Other than that, we've now switched to Phillips head screws as well to get out of these instead of these Torx T6s that we had on the outside. So let's keep digging a little bit deeper. I'm kind of interested in this. Now that the screws are all undone, the only thing that should be holding this main board in place on both sides now is just this display ribbon cable. So very softly, a little plastic tool or your fingernail, very gently lift this little black clip down, or lift the black clip, I guess. Pull that ribbon cable out, and now the display is disconnected. I'm just going to pull this out, hopefully, this little LED bar. Now these boards can get pulled out. That's both sides of the board out. Looking at the other side of both of them, they're identical. I can't tell any obvious difference between these looking at them left to right. So the internal wires of the original brick versus the hammer is exactly the same of the main board. But that's not what we're here to look at. The actual important bit, or interesting bit, I guess, is these speakers, which are confirmed, in fact, very different. It's interesting. Okay, now that we've discovered that, we should definitely do a sound comparison of the both. Moving on from the teardown and the discovery that the speakers have indeed been updated, I feel it would only be right to do a comparison. With those few tests, it's pretty easy to see that the new speakers do perform a little bit better, which is a little surprising to me due to the metal shell, which can distort how audio sounds and bounces since it's more rigid. Now, that actually may be the reason for the upgrade. Perhaps the original speakers performed poorly in the new metal shell, but indeed it has been improved, though both are heavily lacking in the bass department, but that's not surprising in the slightest due to, well, the size of the drivers themselves. I will also say to take this little comparison with a big old grain of salt. Keep in mind that the original is a much older device relative to this hammer with much more use and carry time, which could have an impact on the performance of the speakers. I'm not sure how the speakers and the hammer will do with age. Moving on from audio to the screen, it is still just as beautiful as the original. The higher resolution and clarity compared to other devices in the bracket still makes this thing the king of the category. I have had no issues with the screen on either device, and I definitely prefer it to the screens on things like the Miu Mini and the RG35XX Plus. It's just more vibrant and fun to look at, in my opinion. Now, we know that the screen looks great, but how does it feel to, actually play games? By this point, if you've spent any time in the retro handheld hobby, you will know all too well what to expect when it comes to these devices in this form factor. If not though, let's give it a quick rundown in case you're not too familiar, starting with the easiest to run and working our way up. Your 8-bit handheld consoles like the Game Boy and Game Boy Color are going to run flawlessly, as well as your 8-bit home consoles like the NES and the Sega Master System will again have zero issues. Your arcade games for the most part will have no problems, at least the ones I've tried like Street Fighter 3rd Strike. Moving on to your 16-bit consoles, again, no worries with these. So that means things like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. The 5th generation of console, or the 32-bit era, is where the caveats kind of start. So what do I mean by that? Well, more developed emulators like PlayStation 1 have no problems at all in my experience. The Sega Saturn should also run quite well, but I personally haven't tested too much there since I grew up in the PlayStation 2 era and I was a Nintendo kid by proxy just because of my brother and those are the games that I play. Then we have the Nintendo 64, which a lot of the games will actually run and be playable, but the lack of thumbstick here makes the experience pretty poor in a lot of these cases. Moving on from there into the 6th gen, I only have access to the Dreamcast, which again, some games will run, but it's the same caveat as the N64 where the lack of thumbstick really degrades the experience. Then we have those further generation handhelds like Game Boy Advance that runs like a dream and looks amazing doing so on this screen. Nintendo DS is possible, but in my experience, it's not really all that fun due to the lack of, well, a dual screen and the touch capability. Then finally, in my testing is the PlayStation Portable, which again will have some titles run well. I'm sure some adjustments could be made to improve the performance, but it's just not a console that interests me in this form factor since the native 16:9 ratio is just plain too little, and not having a thumbstick again kills the experience. Now, when it comes to these more advanced consoles like the N64 and onwards, I look at these as a bonus or a nice to have, but not a necessity. Realistically, if you're buying this device for those consoles, we've got bigger problems to look at, and your money would be better spent elsewhere, especially nowadays where that sub $100 category is getting some killer devices like the Mangmi Air X and the Ioneer Pocket Mini. And when it comes to DS emulation, the new Anbernic RGDS is really interesting, coming in at under 100, so I may have to get my hands on that for some testing. The games that you would want to play on here run pretty much flawlessly, which is what's most important. Another question that will undoubtedly come up will be, how hot does a hammer get while gaming? Since the original had a substantial hotspot on the backplate during most gaming sessions, and it only got worse in more intense systems. I can happily say that yes, while the device does get warm during gameplay, it's not at all uncomfortable due to the all metal construction. Instead of the original where the backplate was a heatsink, the whole device in this case becomes the heatsink, only getting mildly warm to the touch rather than hot. I can only really explain it as the cool touch that the metal chassis normally has kind of just disappears, so it's not uncomfortable to hold by any means. The brick has been around for a while now, and one of the benefits of that is that custom firmware support is by now quite mature, to be honest, and we're spoiled for choice. The firmware of choice for me has been NextUI by far, and is what I've been using since the OG brick and throughout this entire video. NextUI, for those who don't know, is a custom version of MinUI made for the TrimUI brick specifically. So some of the headaches of the stock firmware have been remedied or fixed, and to be honest, the list is too long to rattle them off here. NextUI also includes some tweaks to MinUI itself that makes using it have way less friction. Things like Pack Store for adding extra emulators or tools is way easier than having to unplug the micro SD, then plug it into a computer and adding them that way. The developers in NextUI are extremely active, releasing updates faster than I could keep up with, and I'm so glad they've added an over-the-air updater to make keeping up to date a whole lot easier. I could gush about NextUI for a while, but I'll leave that for a different video. Now, just because I personally use NextUI, that doesn't mean it's the only option. Things like MUOS and Nuli have been ported to the brick, which you might be familiar with if you own one of the many XX line of devices from Anbernic. There is another fork of MinUI that's been made specific for the brick called PackUI that has seen some love, but in my opinion still lags behind NextUI. Cross-mix from the TrimUI Smart Pro is still supposedly coming, but I'm slowly losing hope of that ever happening. And finally, you just have the stock OS, which realistically, if you just want to be able to boot up your device and play games, that's all you need. I didn't actually realize how many options there are for the brick until I was writing this script, and there's a bunch there that I haven't yet tested on this device. So, with that being said, let me know down below if there's ones that you specifically want me to check out, or if I should do a full roundup of all the options. Putting all of this together makes for an awesome device, which isn't a surprise. The original Brick was by far my favorite EDC device. It's fun to use, handles the games I wanted to play flawlessly. The battery life is pretty good as well, getting a few hours all up of gameplay, but also managing some incredibly low battery usage, only losing a couple of % overnight, which is kind of a miracle on Linux. I do have to say it hasn't been the perfect experience I wanted. Purchasing it was abysmal. Only to when I finally got it, the back buttons were super disappointing, considering they were amazing on the OG. On top of that, I run into some weird power button issues that come and go, where sometimes the device will refuse to go into sleep or wake, but then other times it works as intended. Now, I'm pretty sure that's just a NextUI issue and will probably be fixed in the near future with an update, so that's why I didn't mention it earlier. So aside from those few things, the overall experience has been pretty great. Everything works as intended. Wireless internet works great for things like updating or using SyncThing. Bluetooth works fine, even though it's not something I use all too often. Now, the reason I don't use Bluetooth too much on this one is because I'm kind of a weirdo and I like these wired in-ear monitors, and using them with this guy has actually been a lot of fun. For general gaming, I like to use the 3.5mm jack, and the audio that comes through is more than adequate, and it also has the benefit of not annoying the people around me. An unexpected usage though has been using the Brick Hammer as a DAP or digital audio player. Someone has gone ahead and ported Rockbox to TrimUI, which means I can load up my SD card with all my FLAC high quality audio and enjoy them from the Hammer, essentially turning it into an MP3 player. For this use case though, I have opted to avoid using the 3.5mm jack and instead grab my USB-C to 3.5mm and plug that into the back USB slot to get the most quality out of the experience. So the ultimate question is, should you buy the TrimUI Brick Hammer? Well, as always, the answer kind of depends. I think if you're someone who already loves the OG Brick and wants a more premium and durable feeling version, then yeah, for sure. And that's the camp that I fell into. Other than that, if you don't already have a Brick Hammer, I'm not sure that you should pay the premium price unless you know that you want a pocketable EDC style vertical handheld. I don't think this will be the device for you if you want to sit on the lounge and play games due to its small size. And if you're on the fence on if you even really want to try the Brick, I would definitely suggest getting the OG over this one and saving yourself the pretty pennies. That is, unless you're someone who is sensitive to holding a hot device, since the hotspot on the back of the OG can get pretty significant. And even with all that being said, for 80 to 90 USD, the options are pretty compelling nowadays. If you want an even smaller metal device, then the GKD Pixel is pretty attractive for about 75 USD. If a metal body doesn't interest you, then you have a plethora of devices to choose from. Both the Miyu Mini and Mini Plus are an obvious choice. Then you have the entirety of the Ambernic XX line of devices, with a special mention for the RG40 XXV. If you want a larger, more comfortable device that actually has a thumbstick for those systems that use it, considering that they both have about the same performance as the Brick. To add even more complication, if you want to spend a little bit more money, you can get your hands on the Mangmi Air X or the Ioneer Pocket Mini for a horizontal, even better performing Android device. Truly, we live in an exciting time to be a retro gaming enthusiast. I've got some final thoughts on the Brick Hammer before I go though. First of all, I'm so glad that TrimUI made this device. It ticks so many of the right boxes that I was looking for in an EDC device, or something that I can carry around with me on a daily basis. Now, I just hope that they tackle a clamshell style device to take on the Miyu Flip, the Mini Flip, and the couple Ambernic clamshell devices. So far, TrimUI has had my favorite build quality and feeling devices, so here's hoping for that. I barely touched on the custom firmwares for the Brick in this video since there are so many options. So make sure you let me know down below if I should make a video breaking them down, or a video on how I set up my hammer specifically with NextUI. And finally, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, and since you're still here, why not give it a thumbs up? Click that subscribe button if you want to see more from me. God bless you, stay beautiful, and I'll catch you all on the next one.